When the harsh winter of 1879 swept across the frontier, one man's ingenuity in the face of nature's fury would be the key to his survival. With temperatures plummeting and snow burying everything in its path, his decision to dig a trench would set him apart from those who perished in the freezing cold. Before we dive into this incredible story of survival and resourcefulness, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're captivated by tales of frontier ingenuity, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story will reveal even more incredible feats of human endurance. The blizzard struck without warning. One moment, the sky was clear, and the sun hung low over the horizon. The next, it was swallowed whole by a wall of snow. It wasn't the first storm of the season, but it was certainly the fiercest. In the deep valleys of the Rockies, life had always been harsh for settlers, but now, the land itself seemed to conspire against them. The cold was unlike anything Jacob Blackwood had experienced before. Jacob had lived through many winters since he first arrived at the frontier, but this one felt different. The temperature had dropped faster than any forecast could have predicted. Within hours, the air grew thick with snow, and visibility was reduced to mere feet. Snow piled high against the wooden walls of Jacob's cabin, and the world outside had disappeared into an endless white abyss. Inside, the air was stifling, and the fire crackled desperately in the hearth. Jacob had always prided himself on his ability to build a fire that could withstand the worst of the winter, but even that seemed a struggle now. As the winds howled and the temperatures dipped further, Jacob knew that staying indoors would do little to keep the cold from creeping in. His cabin had always kept the chill at bay, but not this time. Something about the wind tonight told him that his cabin's walls, however sturdy, would be tested like never before. Jacob's mind raced as he surveyed his surroundings. The walls were sturdy enough, built from logs he had carefully selected and stacked himself. The door, reinforced with heavy iron hinges, had held up against countless storms. But tonight, nothing felt safe. That's when his eyes fell on the shovel leaning against the far wall. Jacob had been reading old journals about how early settlers had faced these exact conditions, how they had survived by building snow tunnels and trenches to protect themselves from the worst of the cold. The idea seemed ridiculous at first, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. What if he could dig his way into safety? What if he could create a space insulated enough to hold off the freezing air and allow him to endure the storm until it passed? Without hesitation, Jacob grabbed his coat, pulled on his gloves, and stepped out into the storm. His breath froze instantly as it met the icy air, but he didn't falter. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Every ounce of his rugged pioneer spirit was tested as he made his way to the back of his cabin and began digging. The wind stung his skin, and the snow buried his legs within minutes, but Jacob pushed forward. He knew that this trench would make all the difference. If he could carve through the snow and create a path that was sheltered from the wind, he would be able to survive. His hands ached as the shovel bit into the frozen ground, but he refused to stop. As the hours passed, the trench began to take shape. The work was grueling, and the storm was relentless. The cold seeped through every layer of clothing, gnawing at his bones. Yet Jacob continued, driven by a simple but powerful thought: survival. The night seemed endless. By the time Jacob had completed the trench, he was exhausted, his body numb from the cold. But he couldn't rest. The storm raged on, its fury showing no signs of easing. He had no choice but to take refuge in the small tunnel he had created. It wasn't much, just enough space for him to crouch and catch his breath, but the trench had a certain security to it. The walls of packed snow formed an insulated shell around him, and though the wind howled above, inside was quiet, still, and remarkably warm compared to the world outside. Jacob huddled in the small space, his body shivering from exhaustion. He had dug for hours, and his muscles screamed in protest, but it had been worth it. The trench was holding up. The cold had yet to breach his makeshift shelter. As the night dragged on, Jacob's thoughts turned to the future. He had survived the night, but for how long could this last? This trench was a temporary solution, a lifeline in an extraordinary storm. But what if the weather didn't relent? What if this was only the beginning of the season's cruelest days? He knew he would need to build on this. The trench, while a brilliant first step, would not be enough to protect him indefinitely. Jacob's mind began to churn with ideas: how to reinforce the walls of his trench, how to extend its reach, how to make it sustainable. He had the time, and now he had the will. The snowstorm outside continued to rage as Jacob sat in his temporary shelter, shivering but resolute. He had survived the night, and as dawn began to break, casting a pale light over the white world outside, Jacob Blackwood knew this was only the beginning of his battle with the wild frontier. But in that moment, he had proven something crucial to himself: his determination, his ingenuity, and his will to survive. And that, he knew, would make all the difference. The days following the storm were a blur of exhaustion and struggle. Jacob's trench, though it had provided temporary refuge, had also revealed the limitations of his makeshift shelter. The snow continued to fall in relentless sheets, the wind never easing, and every morning he woke to find more of his trench filled with fresh drifts of snow. His hands were raw, his body weak, and his mind heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Jacob knew that this was the moment when most men would have given up. The brutal cold of the Rocky Mountains could break a man's spirit, leaving him a shell of himself, defeated by nature's endless tests. Yet, Jacob refused to bow to the wilderness. He had come to the frontier with the knowledge that survival would require everything he had, but this storm was different. It wasn't just the cold that threatened him, it was the sheer isolation. In this moment, he had no one to rely on but himself. Each day, Jacob worked tirelessly to reinforce the trench. The snow, while it had provided some insulation, was beginning to eat away at the walls of his shelter. His hands were stiff from the cold, and even the strongest of his tools seemed inadequate against the relentless freeze. He carved deeper into the snow and built walls of wood from the surrounding trees, layering them with the small amount of dry earth he could scrape together. It wasn't enough. The wind, the cold, and the endless snowfall worked together, attempting to break him. Yet, as he dug, he began to realize something. The trench, while flawed, had become his lifeline, a sign of his resilience. It was a small victory, one that might be the difference between life and death. That night, Jacob sat in the hollowed-out space beneath the snow, feeling the cold seep into his bones, but also a strange comfort in knowing that he had created something that was working. It wasn't a permanent solution, but for now it kept him alive. As he huddled there wrapped in layers of fur, he thought back to the lessons of the old pioneers. Their strength was never in their ability to defeat nature, but in their ability to adapt, to endure, and to outlast it. Jacob had faced the storm alone, but in the trench, he had found something more than a temporary shelter. He had found his survival instinct, and with it, the strength to keep going. The storm had subsided by the time Jacob emerged from his trench, his body aching and stiff from the long hours spent in its cramped confines. The sky was still overcast, the air thick with the remnants of the blizzard, but there was a quiet peace now, a brief moment of respite from the fury of the wilderness. He took a deep breath of the cold mountain air, appreciating the stillness after the storm's rage. Jacob's first task was to assess the trench's condition. He had survived the worst of the storm, but he knew it was only a matter of time before another set of harsh conditions would follow. He needed to be ready. His mind was already racing with plans for reinforcing the structure. He would need to dig deeper, fortify the walls with more wood, and perhaps even create a secondary shelter. But for now, he focused on the immediate task at hand: survival. As Jacob surveyed the snow-covered landscape, something caught his eye. A set of tracks, large and unmistakable bear tracks, heading straight for his cabin. His heart raced as he crouched down, studying the prints carefully. A bear, hungry and desperate, had found its way to his door. His mind immediately went to his cabin, the one place he had always considered a safe haven from the wild, but as he followed the tracks, a sinking feeling grew in his chest. The bear's path was direct, purposeful. It was not the random wandering of a creature seeking shelter, it was the careful, deliberate movement of an animal intent on finding something. Jacob's cabin was still a half-day's walk away, but he moved quickly, his heart pounding as he followed the trail. As he neared the clearing where his cabin stood, the tension in the air thickened. His breath came out in visible clouds, his footsteps muffled by the deep snow. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Then, just as Jacob was about to step into the clearing, he froze. The bear was there. It stood at the edge of his cabin, sniffing the air, its massive form dwarfed by the structure behind it. The cabin that had once felt so safe now seemed vulnerable, its walls too thin, its door too flimsy for an animal of that size. The creature was circling, looking for an entry point. Jacob's heart thudded in his chest as the weight of the moment hit him. This wasn't just about surviving the elements. This was survival against one of the fiercest predators in the wilderness. Instinctively, Jacob reached for his rifle, but he knew that firing a shot would only escalate the situation. The bear wasn't attacking yet, but it was clearly interested in something, perhaps food, perhaps the smell of his shelter. He had to act quickly, but carefully. This was no longer just a fight for survival against the storm. This was a confrontation with nature itself. The bear was massive, standing nearly 10 feet tall on its hind legs, its dark eyes scanning the cabin with a determined focus. Jacob's breath hitched in his chest as he crouched low, silently observing the animal. It was far too close for comfort, its enormous frame moving with surprising grace despite its size. Jacob's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain still. His rifle was in his hands, ready, but he knew that firing at the bear could provoke it into attacking. He had learned from others who had faced similar situations that the key wasn't just the weapon you had, but how you used your knowledge of the creature's behavior. Bears were intelligent, and a gunshot might cause this one to react with more aggression or desperation. Jacob wasn't willing to risk that. The wind had died down after the storm, and the quiet was unsettling. He could hear the bear's heavy breathing, the soft crunch of its paws pressing into the snow. It was circling, searching for an opening, its sharp claws scraping against the wooden frame of the cabin. Jacob clenched his jaw. He knew that the cabin, though sturdy, wasn't built to withstand a determined bear. It was a good shelter against the elements, but it would be nothing against an animal of this size. His mind raced as he considered his options. He could retreat into the snow trench he had dug, but that would leave his cabin vulnerable. And while the trench had offered him safety from the storm, it wouldn't protect him from an angry grizzly. He had to make a decision: act now, or risk losing everything. As the bear began to sniff around the cabin's door, Jacob took a deep breath. He moved quietly, stepping into the shadow of the trees just outside the clearing. He didn't want to spook the bear, but he needed to get its attention. The rifle in his hand was the best tool he had, but it wasn't a guarantee. Jacob's plan was simple: distract the bear long enough to get it away from the cabin, where he could make a safer escape or find better ground for a standoff. The bear's large curved back was now turned toward him. Jacob knew this was his moment. Without a sound, he took a few careful steps backward, making sure to stay behind the cover of the trees. Then, with a quick, deliberate motion, he fired a shot into the air. The loud crack of the rifle echoed across the valley, breaking the eerie silence of the winter landscape. The bear immediately froze, its ears perking up. It spun on its haunches, snarling in confusion as it looked around. Jacob held his breath, knowing the next few seconds would be crucial. The bear growled, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through the air, but it did not charge. Instead, it took a cautious step backward, eyeing the trees where Jacob had disappeared. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He was holding his ground, but he knew that this was only a temporary victory. The bear might leave for now, but it could return, and next time, it might not hesitate to break down the door. The bear's retreat was short-lived. As Jacob stood there, heart racing, his thoughts began to shift from mere survival to the realization that he couldn't keep running from these threats. The wilderness was unforgiving, but there was always a way to adapt. The storm had shown him that. And now, the bear's attempt to breach his cabin was the second reminder he needed. He needed something more than just a snow trench and a rifle. He needed a solution, one that would keep him safe, not just from the elements, but from the constant dangers of the frontier. Jacob returned to his cabin after the bear had wandered off, its footprints still visible in the snow around the door. He carefully checked the perimeter, ensuring that no damage had been done to the structure. The door was still intact, but the thought of what could have happened lingered in his mind. The bear had tested his defenses, and while they had held for now, there was no telling how long that would last. That night, as Jacob sat beside the dwindling fire, he couldn't stop thinking about the future. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on using his hands and knowledge to survive in the wild. But he now understood that survival wasn't just about being tough, it was about being smart, about using the environment and the tools available to you in the best possible way. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He would need to build a stronger shelter. The trench was useful, but it was temporary. The cabin, though solid, wasn't built to withstand the most determined predators, and the storm had shown him just how vulnerable it could be when the elements turned against him. Jacob had always been a man of practicality, and now he was thinking of ways to reinforce his shelter. The snow had been an unexpected challenge, but it had given him an idea, a way to adapt to the ever-present threats of the wilderness. Jacob spent the next few days gathering materials. He had already started making plans for the next phase of his survival. The trench, while invaluable, would no longer be enough. It would need to be expanded, reinforced with stronger materials to create a new type of shelter. His mind was already racing with designs, using the natural landscape to his advantage. He would build a structure that could withstand not just the freezing temperatures, but any wild animal that dared to approach. As he worked through the days, his hands once again became calloused, the cold biting into his skin. But this time, the work felt different. He wasn't just trying to survive the storm anymore. He was preparing for something more, a future where he wouldn't have to constantly worry about the cold, the bears, or the endless challenges of the frontier. This new structure would be his fortress. And, with that thought, Jacob felt a sense of resolve that would carry him through the long winter ahead. The days turned into weeks as Jacob worked tirelessly on his new project, the construction of a shelter that would keep him safe from the harshest of conditions. With the trench proving invaluable during the blizzard, he decided it needed to be extended and reinforced. But it wasn't just a trench. Jacob was determined to transform it into something more substantial, a hybrid structure that would combine the best of both the trench and the cabin. He knew he couldn't do it alone, but he didn't have a choice. His hands were blistered from the work, his muscles sore from the repetitive digging and hauling of logs, yet the work gave him focus, purpose. The weather had turned colder in the last few days, and snow had started to fall again, though less intensely than before. Jacob was under no illusion. This was the calm before another storm. He had to prepare, and he had to prepare fast. As he dug and reinforced the trench, Jacob relied heavily on the trees around him. He had to cut carefully selected logs, stripping them of their bark and shaping them into thick walls. He laid these logs parallel to the trench's original path, stacking them higher as a barrier. He then filled the spaces between with a mixture of pine resin and clay, a method he had learned from older settlers who had long since passed. This compound acted as both insulation and a sturdy bonding agent, keeping the logs tightly together and further reducing the wind's ability to penetrate the structure. Days blurred together as Jacob toiled away. His small cabin, once a symbol of refuge, now felt secondary to the trench he had built beneath it. He was transforming the ground beneath his feet into something far more secure, a shelter that would offer a fighting chance should another grizzly decide to pay him a visit. Though his plans were ambitious, Jacob's mind was always calculating. Each new step in construction brought him closer to something that felt like real security. The snow piled high around the trench walls, yet the trench itself seemed to grow stronger with each layer added. The structure began to look less like a simple hole in the ground and more like a subterranean fortress, one that could withstand the coming trials of winter. The project was no small feat, and Jacob felt his body wear down as the days stretched on. His back ached, his legs were stiff, and his hands bled from the constant friction, but he refused to stop. Each log that went into place, each inch of the trench that was reinforced, brought him one step closer to safety. He was building not just for today, but for the long, unforgiving months that still lay ahead. And with every log, every swing of the axe, Jacob felt a renewed sense of purpose. This trench would become more than just a survival tactic, it would be his new home. By the end of the week, the trench was nearly complete. The walls were high enough to provide cover from the harshest winds, and the roof had a solid structure made of logs and reinforced with branches. Jacob stepped back, surveying the work he had done. The trench wasn't just a hole in the ground anymore, it was a fortress built from sweat, blood, and determination. Jacob had never been one to shy away from hard work, but there was something about the peace that came with the completion of his trench that felt almost foreign. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a moment to rest. His body was exhausted, and the constant threat of nature had kept him in a state of vigilance, always preparing for the worst. But now, with the trench secure, there was a sense of accomplishment, albeit temporary. That peace, however, would not last long. The weather had turned colder over the past few days, and Jacob could feel the bite of the mountain air cutting through his layers of clothing. He was used to the cold by now, but this felt different, crisper, sharper. It was a warning sign, one that set his nerves on edge. The storm was coming, and Jacob knew it would be one to remember. The first signs came late one afternoon when the sky shifted from gray to a deep, almost unnatural black. Snow began to fall heavily, not the soft, gentle kind of snow, but thick, wet flakes that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. Jacob felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't just another winter snowstorm. It was a blizzard, one that would push the limits of even his reinforced trench. By evening, the winds had begun to howl. The storm raged with a fury that shook the trees around his cabin and sent waves of snow swirling through the air. Jacob watched the storm unfold from the safety of his trench, now a solid structure he could take shelter in. The snow piled up higher and higher, quickly filling the trench with its icy weight. Yet, as the storm raged on, Jacob knew that his work would soon be put to the ultimate test. As he huddled inside the trench, the snow reached the top of the walls. The wind howled, louder than any storm he had encountered before, shaking the snow above him and sending drifts pouring over the edges. The trench was holding up, but only just. The walls creaked under the pressure of the snow, and Jacob could feel the weight shifting as the trench was slowly buried under the fury of the storm. Minutes felt like hours as he waited, shivering not from the cold but from the anxiety of the unknown. Would the trench hold up, or would the weight of the snow crush the work he had spent weeks building? The storm showed no signs of slowing. Jacob could hear the crackling of the wind and the thunderous sound of snow collapsing onto the surface. The trench had passed its first test barely. But as the storm continued through the night, Jacob could feel the raw power of nature pushing against him, testing every ounce of resolve he had. He had survived the blizzards of the past, but this time it wasn't just the cold he was fighting. It was the relentless, overwhelming force of winter itself. And in that fight, Jacob would have to rely on everything he had built, not just the trench, but the strength that had kept him going this far. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity. Snow whipped through the air in thick, unrelenting sheets, and the wind screamed like a beast in the night. Jacob's trench had withstood its first trial, but he was under no illusion that it would survive unscathed for long. The wind continued to howl against the reinforced walls, pushing snow deeper into every crack and crevice. The weight was incredible, and every gust that shook the structure sent a fresh wave of anxiety rippling through Jacob's chest. But as the hours stretched on, Jacob found a strange peace in the shelter he had created. The wind outside felt distant, muffled by the thick walls of snow. Inside the trench, it was eerily quiet, safe, almost despite the storm's violent presence just beyond the barrier. The warmth he had managed to preserve in his small, insulated space was a comfort, a reminder that his work had not been in vain. The night passed slowly, each hour blending into the next. The trench held firm, and though the walls groaned under the weight of the snow, Jacob's determination only deepened. He had been tested. The wilderness had shown its cruelty, but he had faced it head-on. The trench had proven to be his lifeline, both in the storm and in his broader battle for survival. At dawn, the wind finally began to subside. The heavy clouds parted just enough to let pale rays of sunlight trickle through the thick snow. Jacob emerged cautiously from his shelter, his body sore and stiff from the cramped confines of the trench. The world outside had transformed into an untouched white wasteland, the aftermath of the storm laying heavily on the landscape. The snow, now several feet deep, lay in silent heaps around him. The entire world seemed suspended in time, holding its breath. Jacob stepped forward, his boots crunching in the thick blanket of snow. His trench was nearly buried, but the structure still stood, solid and unyielding. As he walked to the edge of the trench, he looked around, surveying the damage. The snow had piled high, but the trench itself had withstood the storm. There was a small sense of victory in his chest as he realized that he had made it through the worst. But even in this moment of triumph, Jacob knew he could not let his guard down. The storm had passed, but the winter was far from over. There would be more tests ahead, more challenges to face. The wilderness, though temporarily quiet, was still a dangerous, unpredictable force. Jacob had learned that the hard way, but it was a lesson he would carry with him in the months to come. The sense of calm that settled over him was fleeting, but it was enough. He had survived, and for now, that was all that mattered. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Jacob's life settled into a rhythm. The trench, now a permanent fixture of his existence, had become more than just a temporary shelter. It had become his sanctuary. Every day, Jacob ventured out to check the perimeter, reinforcing the trench as the snow continued to pile up. He had long since adapted to the rhythms of the wilderness, understanding that survival was not just about the will to endure, but also the wisdom to adapt to the ever-changing landscape. Jacob's thoughts turned frequently to his past, to the lessons he had learned and the people he had lost along the way. His partner, once a steady companion in the wilderness, was now nothing but a memory, one of many he carried with him like a weight on his heart. The isolation of the mountains, the cold, and the constant battle for survival had a way of stripping away everything but the raw, unyielding will to live. But with each passing day, Jacob found solace in the fact that he had built something that would endure beyond his own time here. The trench had proven itself in the worst conditions, and now it was a symbol of his ingenuity, his ability to adapt, and his refusal to succumb to the unforgiving forces of nature. As winter began to loosen its grip and the first signs of spring appeared, Jacob's thoughts shifted to the future. He had survived another winter, this one unlike any other he had faced, and had learned more about the land and himself than he had ever thought possible. The trench was a reminder of what he had accomplished, but more than that, it was a testament to the human spirit, to the belief that even in the harshest of environments, survival was possible. Jacob knew he would never be free of the wilderness, not truly. It was in his blood, and it would always be a part of him. But the trench had become more than just a shelter, it was a legacy, a symbol of what one man could achieve with enough determination, skill, and willpower. His story would not be forgotten. His survival would become a quiet legend in the mountains, a reminder that no matter how fierce the storm, no matter how strong the bear, a person who refuses to quit can outlast even the most unforgiving of circumstances. Jacob stood at the edge of the trench, looking out over the now quiet landscape. The snow had finally stopped falling, and the harsh winds had given way to stillness. The storm had passed, but the lessons it had taught him would stay with him for the rest of his life. In that moment, Jacob understood that survival wasn't just about fighting against nature, it was about understanding it, working with it, and, above all, refusing to let it break you. And that was the greatest victory of all.